Hello guys, and welcome to the very first video demonstration for painting class. Here we're doing a Grisaille still life painting with just one object. So I'm using white paint, which is Permalba, a mix of titanium and zinc. I like it, it's creamy, it handles well, and it has a good tinting strength. A lot of times I like to use lead white paint actually, but we're gonna not do that for the sake of this class, just for toxicity levels. Lead is quite poisonous, as you may imagine. Here we have raw umber paint. You can use either raw or burnt umber. Raw just has kind of a cooler, greener tone to it, and burnt umber is a warmer brown. Either way, you should get a nice tonal range out of it. So a Grisaille painting is when you use basically one color and white. Here's my palette knife. You can see it's had a lot of loving use over the years. I just want to show you how I mix. It's very important to have a palette knife that isn't too stiff, because a lot of the ones you find in the stores are just way too stiff and brittle. So I like to feel that it's really bendy, so I feel like I can mix the way I want to be able to mix. And that was just basically to show you how I mix my paint. I tend to mix more with the palette knife and not with the brushes, because I don't want the paint to get all stuck up in the ferrule, that's the metal part of the brush. Also make sure you have paper towels available for wiping off your brushes and for your palette knife and for cleanup at the end. And I will show you how to clean up. So you see in the background, that's the little vase that I'm going to be painting. It's actually a replica of a Faliscan vase that I bought in Italy during my time studying art there. So that's going to be the medium that we use, which is liquid. It's a nice all-purpose medium. It's an alkyd, which means it's basically a plastic resin, and we're going to be mixing it into our paint later. And this is Gamsol, which is paint thinner, and we're going to be cleaning our brushes with it at the end, but we're also going to use it for our very first initial layer of paint. It's going to dry quickly, and basically after all of the canvas is filled up, we're not going to mix the Gamsol into the paint anymore. We're just going to do liquid from that point on. Here's just an example of some of the brushes that I like to use. You want to have a nice variety, some things that can make thinner lines and some things that are nice and thick for a faster, bigger application. And you want to have two glass jars, one for clean brushes and one for dirty brushes that are in use at the time. So you don't mix them. A lot of times the mistake that students make is they just leave their brushes on their palette and then they roll around in the paint and the paint gets everywhere. It gets on your hands, on your clothing, and of course this isn't like acrylics. Oil paint takes a really long time to dry. Some colors more than others, like alizarin crimson. I would find alizarin crimson everywhere after I had used it when I was first a student. And it's very hard to get out of clothing, so in general you want to be careful and try to be a little neater when you paint. And here's my demo for the Grisaille painting. First I take paint that's been diluted with a lot of Gamsol to really thin it out. It's pretty runny. It's kind of a medium to lighter color. And I'm just sketching in the envelope of where the shape is going to be. Thinking about overall placement and thinking about the larger proportions. If you take my drawing class, I talk a whole lot more about measurement there, but we'll talk a bit about it here too. And I don't always start everything exactly the same way. One of the differences between art and craft is that craft has you pretty much visualize the end right away and have a very straightforward path in pursuing it. My path tends to fluctuate. There's a little bit of jumping into the unknown each and every time, and a more organic way of approaching form. A lot of times if I'm working on a portrait, I'll do a more elaborate drawing underneath before I start painting. If it's a very complex still life, I might do that as well. But for landscapes and simpler still lifes and just little portrait studies, I prefer to jump right in. If you want to draw ahead of time before you start painting, we have a nice little sepia pencil for you to be able to do that with. It shows up nicely on the white surface. And also usually you can draw with it on a painted surface once the paint is dry to the touch. If the sepia pencil isn't really taking to the oil paint, if you're drawing once it's dry, you could always use a charcoal pencil That tends to show up pretty well, but it's also a little bit messier for afterwards when you paint back over it. So here I'm using a measuring stick, which is just a barbecue skewer. You can buy at any grocery store. And I'm looking over to where I have my object set up, like you saw in the setup video. And I'm marking off with my thumb, and I'm just comparing the height of it to the width of it overall. And we'll talk about measurement more later too. But a really good way to do things is to generally compare the height of an object to a width of an object. Or to find one measurement, let's call it x, for example the widest part of the width, and then see how many times does x fit into y, which is the height, or where can I find the measurement x on the height. For example, I found it from kind of the base of the round body going up to one of those top stripes. So I like to every now and then stop and check my measurements as I go along to make sure that I'm not really way off base, because our brain can definitely play tricks on us. There are all sorts of optical illusions that we want to be able to catch as we go along. That's my approximation of where the table ends and the background begins. And here I'm just checking to make sure that I actually made it the same level up. Trying to get shadow shapes as accurately as you can is very, very important in terms of establishing both the light situation and the plane of the surface that the object is resting on, and really making it feel like it's sitting there and not just floating in the air. One thing our brain tends to do is equalize spaces, and I want to make sure that I'm not doing that. I want to make sure that the space from the bottom of my painting to the object is not the same as the space from the top of the painting to the object, and that the sides are not equal either, unless I'm specifically going for bilateral symmetry, which I do sometimes. But remember that our brain tends to equalize too much, and that can lead to kind of a stiff and dead feeling composition. For example, I put that line too close to the halfway point, because that's kind of the way it was and what I was seeing, but it's not good for the composition. You never really want a horizon line or a table edge to split the painting exactly in half, so I'm lowering it a little bit here so that we can have a bit more of the background and a bit less of the table surface. Now remember, this is my first layer directly onto white canvas, in this case a board, so I'm using Gamsol to dilute my paint to basically make it a wash that I'm putting on pretty quick. A pretty thin and loose wash, but not so loose that it gets really drippy. I know that I'm never going to get the color right off the bat. In this case, we're not really dealing with color, we're just dealing with value, which is light and dark. So I'm just taking my first best guess, and my goal at this point is to try to be as accurate as I can without stressing about it too much and just covering up all that white, because I know I'm never going to see values accurately as long as they're up against that really harsh white. What I used to do is I used to tint the canvas with an imprimatura, which is basically just a stain of paint diluted with Gamsol or with turpentine, which is what we used to use before Gamsol. Gamsol is a little bit less toxic because it's easier to find values when you're not working on a white surface. Nowadays, I actually don't do that. I don't make an imprimatura because I like having the bright white underneath and then building up from it, because then my lighter tones stay more brilliant. Sometimes when you paint light colors over a medium or darker ground, they can be a little dull looking. But you can try painting with an imprimatura and without an imprimatura and see which you like better. That's the thing about art. It's less about finding the objectively right answer and more about finding the thing that works for you. So right now my biggest objective is just get rid of all that white. So I mixed up a slightly darker mixture to go for that shadowy part of the end of the table. Of course, it's not really a table, it's just a piece of cardboard I put under there, but it's the right tone that I was looking for. You can see the paint is pretty translucent at this point because it's so diluted with Gamsol. That's why you can see the brush strokes so clearly, which is not going to be the case later on. Now you'll notice that I actually did the background first. Usually students will focus in on the object and do the object first. Ideally, it's best to kind of work it all at the same time. But here this is a pretty small painting, so I just wanted to get the context right and then go in for the actual object itself. And it's not super important what order you do it in. It's just that you don't want to get fixated into a certain small portion of the painting and keep working that back and forth and getting into details and stuff like that before you have an overall context. Go for the large relationships first and then the details. Always go for the generals and then the specifics. A refrain we used to use at the Jerusalem Studio School when I studied there was to be general about your specifics and specific about your generalities. That means try to be as accurate about the large shapes and the large relationships. Relationships meaning light and dark, meaning color, saturation, all that good stuff. We'll be talking about all that stuff later on. For right now, our relationships, our large relationships that we're dealing with, are about value, light and dark, because we're not dealing with color really yet. And it's also about just trying to get the shapes right in relation to each other, and eventually the edges, but we'll be talking about edges a whole lot more afterwards too. One thing I think about as I paint is, does this area I'm working on belong to the shadow world or the light world? It's very easy to get those confused, and I want to make sure that I have clarity about that. You can see that here, my used brushes that are wet with paint aren't actually in a glass jar because I'm keeping them on my easel itself, and that's something I like to do, and it's a way I can keep organized and neat. Find the thing that works for you. A lot of times, 2 glass jars seems to be a good way for people to go. Now, I found that I diluted my dark paint here a little bit too much, so I'm having trouble actually putting it down as dark and steady as I would like, which means I'll wait for that to dry a little bit more, and then I'll go back over those areas. There are 2 different types of darks that I'm dealing with. One is just the darks produced by the shadow of the form turning away from the light, but then also there's some actual dark paint on the object itself, so that's going to look even darker inside of those shadows. And you never want shadows to look too dark overall because you want them to look transparent. You want them to be filled with the ambient light that's all around the room, that's coming from the sky, that's hitting the walls and the table and reflecting off of everything. You never want your shadows to just be a pitch black hole. And I'm still very much at the point where I'm just taking my first best guess, with the understanding that these are not really that accurate, and I'm going to be adjusting everything as I go along. A big mistake that students make is when they fill up the canvas, sometimes they think, well, I must be done. No, when you filled up the canvas, when you covered up all the white, that's when everything's just getting started. You gotta have patience when you paint, and you have to make friends with the idea of making mistakes, because it's by making mistakes and then correcting my mistakes that my painting moves forward. And if I'm too stiff and anxious as I go along and build my painting, if I'm too scared of making mistakes, a lot of times that'll come across in the final product and it's going to feel lifeless, stiff, maybe not quite as exciting or interesting as if I let it develop a bit more organically. So you'll see later on I'll be making even more mistakes than I'm making right now. And I'll be correcting these mistakes and other mistakes. And that's all part of the process. We've still got some pesky white in there, and I just want to get rid of those last little bits, while also trying to understand the structure of what's going on down there. You can see that I'm doing a fair bit of generalizing, taking dark areas and not necessarily describing every little thing that's going on in there, but unifying certain parts. And I can break them down further later, if I want to. Sometimes I find that I don't want to. Generally, I like to keep a couple of brushes that are for my lighter colors and a couple that are for my darker colors. If I mix them too much, the brushes will get muddy. I'm also careful when I paint to try not to get the paint stuck up in the ferrule or the metal part of the brush. If it gets up there, it can make it much harder to clean. And also, if it dries up there, it can really mess up the shape of the brush, splay it out. And that's bound to happen eventually, but I try to delay the death of my brushes as long as possible. One thing that I'm asking myself at this point is, where are my darkest darks and where are my lightest lights? And do I have that correctly in my painting or not? I want to establish a hierarchy of lights and a hierarchy of darks. It's a type of visual organization of my painting that will bring a lot of clarity to what I'm seeing. So I ask myself, when I look at my motif, the motif is that part of the visual world that I'm representing in paint. When I look at the actual motif out there in real life, are the darkest darks I'm seeing matching up to what my darkest darks are in my painting? If not, I need to change my painting. Do you see in my painting areas that are cooler in tone and areas that are warmer in tone? That coolness happens as I mix more white into the paint. The areas that are light but feel warm are areas where the paint was simply diluted more, so you're seeing more of the ground coming through. Later on, as my paint isn't going to be quite so diluted and see-through, it's going to take on a more cool overall tone, because there's going to be a lot more white mixed in to form those lighter areas and the midtones. Right now I'm taking kind of a medium, soft, puffy brush, and I'm tapping things down a little bit. Those brush strokes are visually distracting, and I want to unify the surface more. It's easier for me to judge the relationship of tonal values against each other if there isn't so much static in terms of brush strokes. I want to kind of get flatter shapes that I can judge against one another. So with this tapping motion, I'm just unifying certain areas together a bit and controlling a little bit of edge quality too as I go along. There's a lot of softening that's happening as well as unifying. When I'm painting, I'm always thinking in terms of polarities, light and dark, sharp edges and soft edges, and also unity and diversity. If a painting doesn't have enough diversity, enough various elements thrown together, it's just not going to be visually interesting. But then if you're not able to ultimately unify it and pull it together to make some sort of a balanced or harmonized statement, it's never really gonna work as a visual statement that could just stand up and hold its own. So there's always this push and pull between unity and diversity. I add more stuff, and then I ask myself, well, did I just wreck the unity? Probably. So let's do something to pull it together a bit more, and then I can keep going. You could do it by softening with a brush like I'm doing right now. Or if the paint is thicker, you can do it by scraping with a palette knife. Or you can even do it by taking a rag and just going over the entire surface until you only have a ghost impression left. And that ghost impression will be very unified and a pleasure to paint back into. Make sure that every now and then you get up from your seat and you go look at your painting from across the room. When you're too close to your painting, you could start missing certain obvious things. It can be very helpful to see it from further away or even to see it upside down. Another thing that you could do is to look at your motif and your painting at the same time in a mirror, and that sort of distances you a little bit and helps you see some of the tricks that maybe your brain has been playing on you, some of those optical illusions which are happening all the time. Until I started painting seriously, I didn't realize how much my brain was messing with me all the time. Now my attitude towards my own brain is much more one of trust but verify. So I paused for a few hours letting the paint dry a little bit before going back in. Now that I'm not dealing with a white surface anymore, I'm going to be using liquid to mix in with my paints. It is my preferred paint medium. I've tried so many different paint mediums over the years, and liquid is just the one that I like the handling of the most. And I also like that it produces a satin quality of the surface, not too shiny and not too matte, in the middle where I like it. It also has a leveling effect on the brush strokes where you could still see individual strokes, but they don't tend to stand up, which I prefer because then they don't catch the light in a way that I find distracting. I tend to like a smoother, more fresco-like way of painting, and liquid is very helpful with that. Something can definitely be both textured and flat at the same time. You see, if you have peaks of paint that stand out from the surface of your board or your canvas, they're going to be catching the light, which is especially distracting in areas that are midtones or shadows. Sometimes people do that on purpose on areas that are light, and that can be fine if that's an effect that you want. But in general, I prefer a more unified looking surface. And I'm starting here by establishing kind of my lightest areas right away. Remember how I was talking about a hierarchy of lights and darks? Well, I dealt with my darks a bit, and now I'm going into my lights. I'm touching my pinky finger to the edge of the painting to help stabilize my hand. A lot of times artists will use something called as a maul stick to lean against, but I find that between my pinky finger and balancing my elbow on my knee, I do pretty well. Right now I'm thinking about the large relationships and feeling like I want to take the background darker so that the light on the surface of the vase can stand out much more against it. You can see that this new color is less transparent, although it still has some translucent quality to it, and because there's more white mixed in, it's got a cooler tint than the lower layers. At this point, I'm realizing that I really didn't wait quite as long as I should have before going back into it because the bottom layers aren't totally dry yet. The Gamsol helps dry them, and they certainly would have been dry by the next day. Liquid will also speed up the drying qualities of your paint to where they should be dry to the touch the next day. So I'm going to do a little bit in this session, and then I'm going to wait until the next day to get back to it. Sometimes I paint with a knife too, but right now this paint is really too wet for a knife to be too good with it. I'm trying to stay away from details at this point and just try to understand the overall atmosphere and light situation of the painting. Now I'll soon tell you more about my process of cleaning brushes, but I like to leave my brushes coated in something called Turpenoid Natural, which keeps them nice and flexible and conditions them, but I never want the Turpenoid Natural to touch the actual paint in my painting. So whenever I use a brush like this one right here that has been sitting around in Turpenoid Natural, first I want to rinse it in the Gamsol, which takes off the Turpenoid Natural, and then I wipe it off a little bit on my paper towel, and then I'm good to go. There are many different ways of applying paint to a surface. The way you touch the canvas dictates the type of texture that appears. There are times when you might want to do more of a stroke, or more rubbing, or more tapping. The more you paint, the more you'll know what kind of a touch you want to apply at any given time. You'll just develop the instinct for it. I'm still trying to think as simply as I can about light side and shadow side, and not to ever get my light world confused with my shadow world. And now I'm looking a little bit for those darker painted areas within the shadows, starting to differentiate my shadow mass a bit more. Now it's been a few days since I've been at this painting, so it's dry to the touch now, so I'm going to need to oil out because some of the colors have actually changed, especially the darks. They've gotten a little bit lighter. So I'm taking my medium, which in this case is liquid. I'm putting a little bit of it on a makeup sponge, and then you can see that the darks get just a little bit richer. And also it lubricates the surface and makes it easier for the paint to come on. I want to make sure that I cover any area where I'm going to be painting, or I think I might be painting today, and use the smallest amount of liquid possible. And whatever your medium is, usually you can oil out with your medium. So I'm just making sure that I don't have any liquid accumulated anywhere. I just want the barest possible amount on there. Obviously, if the painting is still wet to the touch, you don't want to oil out at all. Those makeup wedges are super handy. Now my brushes have been resting in Terpenoid Natural, so obviously I don't want to get that non-drying oil anywhere near my painting. So I make sure to rinse them out with Gamsol first, wipe on a paper towel, and then I'm good to go. Now as I sat and looked at this painting for a while, I realized I actually made the whole thing too narrow. So I used my measuring stick, and I measured again the height versus the width, and I realized, yep, I'm seeing correctly. I definitely made it too narrow, so I'm going to have to widen the whole thing up. So that's what you're going to see me doing right at the beginning. Sometimes I like to take my paint on my palette knife and hold it up close to the paint on the actual canvas, and that helps me see how I need to change the color. So this is a pretty dramatic change that I'm making today. But don't be afraid to make dramatic changes. It's not heart surgery, it's just a painting. You can take risks. You learn from taking risks. Be brave, be bold. If you see something that needs to be addressed, just go for it. Remember that the road to becoming a great painter is just going through miles and miles of canvas. So every time I pick up a new brush that's been resting, I wash off the Terpenoid Natural in Gamsol, I wipe it off, and then I paint with it. It really only takes a second. Enjoy the rest of the demo.